What's up, Green Bay Packers fans? Welcome back. As always, thank you for joining me. My name's Paul Brettel. Today we're here to discuss urgency, something Brian Gutekunst has talked about this offseason. What did he mean by it? Who is he talking about? And has he shown enough urgency in his offseason approach to bolster this Packers roster? Before we do all that, you know what to do. Hit like in the video, hit subscribe in the YouTube channel. I do greatly appreciate it. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work, including the article versions of everything we discuss here over at ESPNLacrosse.com. And my Wisconsin sports radio fans, Packers, Brewers, Bucks, Badgers, download the 105.5 ESPN Lacrosse app. As I mentioned, urgency. Something that Brian Gutekunst spoke about in his season-ending press conference after that loss to Philadelphia. A lot of topics were covered, but one thing that he brought up was urgency, specifically wanting to see more of it throughout this Packers team. And in his words, not getting complacent. That urgency component, obviously, it's front of mind for Gutekunst, right? Or was it that time of the year? He brought it up. And so it's going to have to be, or it's what he views as an important element for this Packers team, bottling up that sense of urgency, using it to their advantage in how they go about their day-to-day, week-to-week processes in game, obviously. But that's going to have to be an important element to helping this Packers team get over that hump. And as Gutekunst said, start competing for championships. But what did he mean by it? Who is he referring to? During this past week at the NFL League meetings, Gutekunst was asked about that urgency comment, and what he said was, I think the urgency comment is really more for our team, our organization to understand what the expectations are. Now, of course, how the season ended last year is what's going to be cemented in our minds, right? It's what we're going to remember the most, and understandably so, right? The Packers didn't get to where they wanted to be, and those last few games of the season really showcased the areas of opportunity, we'll call it, right? The areas of improvement where this Packers team has to get better if they're going to get to be the level of team that they want to be at. However, I think not to have lost in all of that was that they were playing some good football prior to that Week 17 game against Minnesota. Coming out of the bye week in Week 11, Packers had won 5 of 6 games going into that matchup with the Vikings in Week 17. They had 5. I know obviously the passing game, the offense as a whole sputtered at the end, but they had 5 straight games, again, going into that Minnesota game, where they had scored at least 30 points. So this was a team during that second half of the year that it really did look like things were trending in the right direction. However, and unfortunately, that Vikings game, it's like a switch flipped, right? We saw a similar performance in that game as we had seen throughout the season against the top opponents in the NFC, Minnesota, Detroit, Philadelphia, where the final score wasn't necessarily indicative to how that game actually unfolded and didn't really illustrate or showcase how much the Packers' opponent had controlled that game and had made things extremely difficult for them, not being able to move the ball steadily early on, not being able to put up points, not getting those crucial stops on defense when it was needed. And unfortunately from there, going into a Week 18 game with Chicago at home, a team that Green Bay has had a lot of success with during the Matt LaFleur era, it's like things started to snowball at that point. And rather than, as you would hope, that Minnesota Vikings game being a wake-up call to a degree, right, going into the postseason. But all right, this could be a good thing for us. We can use this to recalibrate and set us on a new direction right again, build some momentum in Week 18 going into the playoffs. It seemed to just snowball from there, right? And we saw a lackluster performance in Week 18 against the Bears, ends in a loss. And then, of course, they faced just what was already a difficult matchup and having to go on the road to Philadelphia to face the Eagles. And before you know it, just like that, despite having won 5 of 6, despite having put up 30-plus points in 5 straight games, the Packers lose 3 games in a row, and before we know it, the season is over. Now, Brian Gutekunst talked about this during his bye-week press conference last season, that playing your best football at the end of the season, going into the playoffs, is such an important element to just postseason playoff success for an NFL team. And I think the 2023 season illustrates that very, very well. During that final month of the year, especially on the offensive side of the ball, Packers were operating as one of the better units in the NFL, right? And they carried that momentum into the playoffs. They were a red-hot team. You saw it against the Dallas Cowboys. They're on the cusp of going to the NFC Championship game against the San Francisco 49ers. And looking at that 2023 season, specifically the last month, there was natural urgency that was created just given the Packers' circumstances that year. they had to win their last 3 games to even be a playoff team, right? Knowing in week 16 that you have to win or your playoff chances are either completely gone or take a massive, massive hit, that's obviously going to create some urgency, right? That's going to raise your level of awareness to just what's happening and how you're going about your process, because essentially the playoffs had started at that point for the Green Bay Packers. This past season, however, well, yeah, they're still fighting for seeding, right? That Minnesota Vikings game in week 17, it was important in terms of, all right, we have to win this game to try to keep the opportunity alive for us to be the 5th seed. So you're still a wild card team, but who you play is obviously drastically different than having to go onto the road to Philadelphia. But while that element was still there, the Packers were a playoff team, right? I don't think anyone in that final month of the season was concerned or worried about the Packers, whether they were going to make the playoffs or not. It was, all right, what seed are they going to be within that playoff race? And so that in itself, those two differences, just in, again, the circumstances that the Packers found themselves in between the 2023 season and the 2024 season, I think just creates a different and a natural difference in what that sense of urgency is. And so I think that element, when we look at the 2023 success that the Packers had, and why couldn't that be replicated in 2024? And again, as always, I always give this disclaimer. There's so many factors that go into everything that we see, and we're talking about 1, 2, maybe 3 of them at most in some of these conversations. So always keep that in mind. But in terms of the urgency, because that's what our conversation is about today, big difference in 2023 where it was a necessity to have that element, to even be in the playoffs, versus in 2024, you're a playoff team. It's just 5, 6, 7 seed. We'll see where we fall in that regard. So going beyond just the natural circumstances, right, that the Packers found themselves in last season, record-wise, seeding-wise within the NFC playoffs, which, as we just discussed, can have a ripple, trickle-down effect of just natural urgency that's created. What might have been another factor into why is this something that has to be addressed, right? Why isn't it already there? Why isn't that urgency already, surging throughout this Packers team, knowing that they're chasing, right, being a championship caliber team? And Matt LaFleur provided some insight into that again at the NFL League meetings this past week. And it aligns with, and I wrote about this following the end of season press conferences, the youth that the Packers have on this team. LaFleur said, I think one thing, especially for young players, is it goes by really fast. And before you blink, it seems like you're at the end of your career. So it's just maximizing those moments and taking advantage on a day-to-day basis and really putting your best foot forward. As LaFleur also went on to say, he's a firm believer you're either getting better or you're getting worse every single day. There is no in between. It's one or the other. So each individual has to take that to heart and maximize their time together. Now, the youth, being the youngest roster in the NFL for 2 seasons, never, ever, ever going to be an excuse for the results on the field, right? And the Packers have never used it as one. It's a result-based business, the NFL. Do you go out there and win games? Do you go out there and put up points? If you're on defense, do you get stops? Do you get turnovers? At the end of the day, that's all that matters. With that said, I think we'd be naive to think that the reality of the Packers having the youngest roster in the NFL, that doesn't play some sort of factor in, maybe some of the learning curve that this roster is going through over these last couple of seasons. And from an urgency perspective, if you come in as a young player, you don't know what you don't know. And all you know is what you've experienced. And so if you come in as a young player, have a lot of success, put up production, the team wins games, you get hot at the end of the year, make the playoffs, that's what you know. That's your reality. That's your world within the NFL. But we also know that every single year in the NFL is completely different. And just because there was past success is certainly not indicative that future success is going to be guaranteed, right? You have to take the same exact approach every day, every week, every year, and prepare the exact same way, because none of that is given. So I think the being the youngest roster in the NFL, again, it's never going to be an excuse, but it's the Packers' reality. And I think in these situations where we're discussing urgency, I think that element, that youth element, is a factor. And again, Matt LaFleur talked about it in terms of that urgency and understanding that your career in the NFL can go by really, really quickly. And so just maximizing, taking advantage of every single opportunity you have, because just because you accomplish something the season prior, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to be able to do that again. You have to go out and re-earn that every single day, every single week, every single game. So we're talking about urgency throughout the roster with the Packers players. But what about Brian Gutekunst? What about the front office? Have they showcased enough urgency this offseason? Leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. Have the Packers front office, Brian Gutekunst, have they been urgent enough this offseason? Now, free agency, I'm going to guess for most, probably didn't play out as expected. We've talked about it a lot. It's been written about a lot, not just me, but everyone out there. Defensive line, wide receiver were coming into free agency, the two biggest perceived needs that the Green Bay Packers had this offseason. And outside of bringing in McCole Hardman, who adds some speed, but has primarily been a return man the last few seasons in Kansas City. And he's on a prove-it deal. Like, he's just looking at his contract, he's not even guaranteed to be on the 53-man roster come September. He is going to have to earn that roster spot. So I'm going to guess, considering that those were the two biggest perceived needs on the outside that the Packers had to address, that this offseason didn't play out as you expected, as you hoped. And even the additions that the Packers did make, Aaron Banks at guard, Nate Hobbs at cornerback, again, I'm going to guess that those are two free agent players that were just not on the radars of many. However, while all that is true, the Packers, in terms of spending this offseason, according to Over the Cap, they rank 11th in the NFL. In terms of average annual value of their free agency contracts that they handed out, they rank 5th. Now, of note, in terms of guaranteed dollars, the Packers do rank in the bottom half of the NFL in terms of guaranteed dollars on the contracts that they handed out this offseason. And of course, guarantees can obviously be an important element, particularly when you're pursuing the more higher end free agents, right? Like how much guaranteed money a player is getting from one team versus another can obviously be a big component in their decision-making process on where they're going to sign, who they're going to play for. But there's also not been any reports out there, right, that so-and-so signed with team XYZ and the Packers were among those interested and lost out because the contract value is different. We don't know if that's the case either. So I think that's just noteworthy, right, the guaranteed portion of it. But in terms of just spending, 11th in spending, 5th in average annual value, Brian Gutekunst, the Packers, I mean, they did spend money this offseason. It just didn't go where I think a lot of us anticipated it to go, or to players that a lot of us anticipated that would be on the Packers' radar. Now, I think also another important factor in all of this as well was just the overall pool of players in this year's free agency class. The general consensus was that this was a so-so free agent class overall from top to bottom. And just because you have cap space, just because you might have a pressing need, doesn't mean that you completely throw your process to the side either, right? Just because you have the ability to go, salary cap wise, to go add a player at a position you might need, doesn't mean you do it just for the sake of doing it to, check off your to-do list and say, well, we addressed the defensive line, we addressed the wide receiver position. You still have your process that you're going to go through. And I'm going to guess that because the overall talent pool of this year's free agency class wasn't as deep as we've seen in previous years, didn't have as much high-end talent again as we've seen in previous years, that the players that the Packers had on their radar in terms of, all right, these are some of the guys we would want to bring in, I'm going to guess that was a small group. So obviously that makes bringing in those players more difficult because there's going to be more teams that are vying for them as well. So I think that's an important wrinkle, again, to be mindful of, because that does impact how the Packers went about the offseason. What's the talent like? What's the talent like at positions in need? What kind of contracts are those players getting? And you are, as a team, as a GM, you're going to have your process for evaluating Do they fit with us on the field? Do they fit with us off the field? What's a fair contract for them? How much are above that are we willing to go? Are we willing to go above that mark? And again, just because there's added cap space or just because the class overall might not be at the level we're used to seeing, again, doesn't mean that you should just throw free agent dollars, salary cap space at those players to check off a box on your to-do list. Now, before we get out of here, I'll say this. Urgency comes in different forms. Just because on the outside world, the perceived need, the perceived urgency should lie at the wide receiver, the defensive line positions, doesn't mean that's how the Packers see things. I mean, clearly, the contract that they signed Aaron Banks to, going out and getting Aaron Banks, tells us that internally, the Packers viewed the offensive line as an urgent need, as a major need that they needed to address. That's what that tells us. And just because that doesn't align with what we talked about on the outside, doesn't mean that it's still not true, right? Doesn't mean that the Packers completely ignored or aren't urgent. Their urgency just lies at a different position. I think when it comes to the cornerback position and Nate Hobbs, I think, and we talked about this, I have a whole video devoted to this on why cornerback was a much more pressing need and much more urgent need than wide receiver and defensive line. Do they need more consistency at receiver? Of course. Does the pass rush need to be better? Absolutely. But you have strong foundational pieces at both of those position groups. You have Rashawn Gary, Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, and others. At receiver, you have Romeo Doubs, Dontavian Wicks, Jaden Reed, Christian Watson when he returns from injury. At cornerback, we don't know what the future holds for Jair Alexander. And before Nate Hobbs was on the team, it was Keyshawn Nixon, Carrington Valentine, and 4 other players who combined have played 116 defensive snaps in their NFL career, and all of them belong to Isaiah Dunn. Just laying that out, the differences in each of those 3 position groups. Cornerback's a lot more urgent than wide receiver and defensive line. So, again, how the Packers went about addressing their needs, what they viewed as urgent, again, for the most part, I'm going to guess, different than what those of us on the outside perceive those urgent needs to be. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't urgency. It was just different. Now, the question, did Brian Gutekunst do enough? Should he have pushed further? Should he have stretched harder? Should he have dipped into the cap space that the Packers have left more to try to bring in a different receiver or another pass rusher along with the needs that they already addressed? We'll have to see, right? I mean, ultimately, one, we have to see how the draft unfolds, right? That's obviously a big part of your roster building process, especially for the Green Bay Packers. And 2, we ultimately aren't going to know even after the draft until we see how things take place on the football field and see if this Packers team is improved. So I wouldn't say there was a lack of urgency from the Packers this offseason. They clearly were urgent about addressing the offensive line. Cornerback was a much more urgent need than receiver and defensive line. They finished 11th, or are currently standing 11th in free agent spending, 5th in average contract value. So I wouldn't say there wasn't a lack of urgency. I would just say it's different. Now, having said that different approach, Gutekunst has to be right on it, right? And that's the big thing that we just mentioned. We have to see how this all unfolds to know whether he was right or not. Because if he wasn't right, there's going to be more questions moving forward about his approach, urgency or not. There's going to be questions around how he goes about his roster building process if we don't see the Packers take a step forward this year. So there you have it, my friends. As always, I really appreciate you tuning in. Hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work over at ESPNLacrosse.com and download the 105.5 ESPN Lacrosse app. Till next time, friends, take care.